Okay, everyone can hear me well, I think. That's good. Please come on in, have a seat. And we'll test out the other mics just to make sure.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. Well, come on in, have a seat. I guess we'll get started. We'll let people file in. So thank you, everyone, for coming to hear about the results of our research. And as you heard on the main stage today, that was part of a project that the OCP asked us to entertain late last year around trying to understand what was their impact in the market and how would we characterize that, and also could we, from looking at the research we had already been doing at IHS Markit on tracking open compute, could we come up with a forecast? So myself, I'm Cliff Grossner, and there it is. And I'm the Senior Research Director and Advisor for the Cloud and Data Center Research Practice at IHS Markit. Right now, we're 15 lead analysts in the practice, and we have 5 support analysts working with us. So we're about 20 people in the practice. We cover everything from physical infrastructure in the data center, so racks, power, and cooling, to IT infrastructure, SDN and NFV, servers, networking, storage, and then, of course, the services that are served out of data centers, cloud services and co-location data centers. And so that's us at IHS Markit. And there were more than the people here on the stage that worked on the project, but I do have 2 of our experts here with me today. Maggie Shillington, say hi.
Nope.
Maggie focuses on racks and power distribution within the rack. And I have Vlad here.
Hi, everyone.
So Vlad focuses on servers. And what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through the research, but I'm not going to bore you for the whole 45 minutes or so. After that, I do have some questions because Vlad and Maggie spent time talking to all the vendors and gathering the data. I wanted you to have a chance to hear from them directly, some of the tidbits that they heard. And then we'll open it up for questions. We'll keep at least 10 minutes for the audience to ask us questions. Okay, so with that, why don't we take a look at what we found, and let me drill down a little bit on some of the conclusions you heard earlier this morning, or today I should say, because I think it's afternoon now. And as I said, the Open Compute Foundation asked us to look at how we could assess their impact, and they asked us to look at a number of product categories. We looked at OCP certified and inspired equipment, and also if someone took a design that was an OC inspired design, for example, or certified design, and asked their vendor to modify it a little bit, we still included it because it was definitely a derivative of an OCP design. And so we looked at servers, networking, storage. Peripherals included transceivers and NIC cards. And we looked at racks, power distribution within the rack, and in other we had PON and Wi-Fi. So those were the equipment categories that we looked at in order to make our assessment. And we specifically were asked to look at non-board member contribution. So what is the impact of the OCP outside of their own enclave? And we interviewed end users. So we interviewed competitive telcos, we interviewed incumbent telcos, and we interviewed co-location providers. We also interviewed vendors. We interviewed OEMs, ODMs, startups, integrators, and white box vendors. And what we did is we brought together forecasts that we already had for OCP equipment at IHS Markit that we do as part of our regular subscription to our clients. And we brought that together with the information we garnered from the interviewees to come up with a view on what was the spend in 2017 and 2016 on OCP inspired or certified equipment, and then a forecast for a 5-year horizon, and breaking that down by the verticals. And so what I have for you today here is I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall numbers we came up with, and I'm also going to share with you some of the results that we are able to derive from the actual interviews. And now, to be clear, we cannot violate the NDA of any one of the particular interviewees, but what we have done is we have aggregated the data that we garnered from the interviews, and we can share that with you today. Now, some of it, I'll be honest with you, might just be confirmation of what we already believed, but what it does tell us is our intuition was on track, and in some cases it might actually make us rethink our positions a little bit. Now, you saw something like this chart this morning, and what I wanted to focus on a little bit more was just some of the detail. And so this morning, you saw this big market for 2017 of 137 billion, and the question you should be asking me is, how did you get 137 billion? And that's 137 billion when I take all of the markets that we said we were going to examine together, and that was the total shipments or revenue in those markets. And then we looked at the OCP number, which was about 1 billion, just a bit more than 1 billion, and then we get about 1%, or a little bit under 1% of that market. And we also showed 103% growth from 2016. So we had a really good push between 2016 and 2017.
What does non-board mean?
Non-board member means that we did not include the revenues or the purchases of equipment by the board members of the OCP. So no Facebook, no Microsoft, no Goldman Sachs, no Rackspace. So this is not a measure of the entire market for OCP equipment. I'm sorry?
The entire market should be a lot bigger.
The entire market is a lot bigger, and I am not at liberty to say what the total market was, because that would tell you what the board member revenue was, which we promised we would not disclose, to respect everyone's privacy. Now, looking forward at 2021, doing a 5-year forecast, what we came to was we believe that the OCP non-board revenue would hit just over 6 billion, and we'd have a 5-year CAGR of 59%. Looking at the same markets, so what we don't know is necessarily what are the other markets that might get entered. So if optical transport, for example, were to spring up as a new market, maybe next year if we would do this, we would then have that as part of the forecast. But for today, we kept to the markets we know about. The other thing, so the next thing you saw Mark put up this morning was a view on what is the revenue by segment. And the red line here is showing you the growth. And so it's normal for us to see growth be a bit choppy. In fact, the reason we see kind of a down for 2018 and then a kick back up by 2019 and then a slower depression is growth tends to slow as the market matures. So that's what we're seeing as an overall trend. And what I believe we're seeing is the kickback in 2019 is the telco market kicking in for SDN and NFV and pulling on OCP equipment. So that's why our growth probably does that. And of course, sometimes it's a bit hard to know because we have all of those markets coming together in one big market. One of the things, some of the interesting points that we wanted to share with everyone was that when we look at 2017, servers accounted for almost 3/4 of OCP non-board revenue. So Vlad was really at the center of the 2017 spend. Then if we looked at the growth rate of OCP non-board revenue, we see that's in high double digits out to 2021, while the other markets, the rest of the non-OCP part of the markets we counted was in low single digits, which is why you see the OCP spend gaining ground from 1% to 6% as the market grows. The other thing that we also saw was areas that had the highest growth rates were the rack, power, peripherals, and other, that is Wi-Fi and PON parts of the market that we measured. So we'll get Maggie to give us a bit more detail on what's going on in the rack and power part. In terms of the Wi-Fi and PON, not much surprise there that it would have a very high growth rate going forward. PON is really at the early phases of gestation. And so it's going from a very small number, we'll see large growth. The other areas that we wanted to share with everyone, and this is maybe a slightly different view of what you saw this morning, that when it comes to a regional perspective, I mean, OCP pretty much got its start in North America. And so no surprise, the Americas dominate in the early years, and it continued to dominate actually in outer years. And we saw that, we see that the domination is due to non-board hyperscaler and financial adoption in the early years, and then in the outer years driven by telco, with a total CAGR for the region, for North America, at 47%. I'm saying North America, but we include Americas, but like it or not, CALA is a pretty small part of the Americas at this point, and it's kind of riding along. If we look at the trends, we also believe, given the activity in APAC, and we do visit there very regularly and have we talk with a lot of the vendors and the end users as well in that area of the world, that the next big wave of growth is really in APAC with a CAGR of 103% out to 2021, and that will surpass EMEA. Now, what's driving growth in EMEA is really the telco base that are very active. If you speak to people like Telefonica and Deutsche Telekom, they're members of the TIP, and they're very active in terms of SDN and NFV rollouts. They're providers that we talk to regularly, and we believe that they're going to be the driving factor in that region. Well, let me see, what have I got next? Okay, here I have by customer segment. So here we have enterprise, service provider telco, service provider hyperscaler, and service provider tier 2 CSP. And very clearly from all the vendors we talk to and the end users we talk to, telco cloud is the next wave for OCP. It's the next major purchasing segment. Telco cloud purchasers will have some very, very specific requirements going forward. And so we have the non-board hyperscalers and the tier 2 CSPs. They were the ones exploring OCP servers in 2016, and we expect them to start larger deployments in 2017 and 2019. We saw telcos, you heard it this morning, POCs increased in 2017. We know they're going to production trials in 2018 from those that we talked to. We're going to see scale in 2018 and 2019 plus. The non-board hyperscalers are the largest OCP switch customers through 2021. So that's a bit surprising to us, as we've been tracking the white box switch market for a while, but we didn't realize, what we found was that the white box switch is actually penetrated in other aspects rather than the non-board hyperscalers. They didn't actually drive that one. They're actually coming around back. Aside from Facebook, they're actually driving, it actually was driven elsewhere. And then when we look at the total OC spend for telcos, that's going to actually surpass the non-board hyperscalers by 2021 in our estimation. So we really see the telcos becoming a driving force. The other high-level chart I wanted to share with everyone is that we had, in terms of the segment of the market, when we look at the enterprise verticals separately from the total market, we saw the financials are deploying the largest number of non-board enterprise OCP products. So that's units percent. And then we had part of the places that they've been going is e-commerce and web-based enterprises, which we learned based on interviews, such as travel fair aggregator websites. They might be the next biggest opportunity. The vendors were telling us they're getting a lot of interest from those particular segments of that vertical. Within other enterprise, which is also a pretty big factor, we had retail and education, and we expect them to become one of the largest enterprise sub-segments for switching by 2021. We also see enterprise customers are going to continue to use AC power at the rack, which means making OCP power the smallest component of their OCP spend because of the differences in how the racks are powered on the OCP side versus what's going on in the enterprise today. And Maggie will talk to us a bit more about that going forward. Okay, so that that was the overview that I wanted to provide you of the market. Now I'd like to take you through, I think it's 7 aggregated responses that we have from the vendors. So what we learned is we asked the vendors to describe their current open compute portfolio, and this is percent of respondents, so we have to be careful how we interpret this. 47% of the respondents that we interviewed were supplying rack and power. Doesn't mean that's all they were supplying, but they were supplying rack and power as one of the elements. 42% of the vendors we interviewed supplied servers, 37% networking, and then we go down and down. Only one vendor is actually supplying PON and Wi-Fi at this point. It's a bit dangerous for me to talk about it because most of you in the room are going to figure out who that is, but we also expect to see more. The good news is many vendors supply more than one OCP product, and we're seeing good coverage on racks, servers, and networking. When we did the work, our conclusion was storage was kind of like the last bastion that hadn't really been tackled. So I'm very happy to see all of the effort being put on storage and the announcements today, because that's really the next area that's been underserved by the OCP very clearly. We also see that PON equipment is new to OCP. No surprise, given the fact that the telco vertical is just really getting geared up, and that's where that's going to go. We can expect more vendors will jump in. There's only one right now. We also saw that the vendors told us that they're now fielding requests about OCP products very regularly, even daily, whereas maybe a year ago, they would have to be pushing the concept of OCP and talking about it. There's been sort of a sea change, if you like, in what the vendors are experiencing, which is this is part of the data that we use when we think about how the market's going to roll out and apply our experience about the physics when we do our forecasts. Of course, we heard software. You're going to hear throughout my presentation, software ecosystem. Really poor, we got to fix it. And all of the data we have was very clear. And I'm not sure which came first, chicken or egg, but thank heavens, again, we started to hear that in the OCP Summit today. Now, so another question we asked the vendors is, what were their plans, their product roadmap? What are they planning to introduce going forward? And we saw some really interesting results. Now, not only were they starting to introduce more than one new product, so they had quite a comprehensive roadmap for those vendors, they also were looking at diversity in the roadmap. So we heard a lot about AI and ML as a target. We heard a lot about server diversity. We heard a lot about 200, 400 gig coming to OCP, and I think there was an announcement on 400 gig today, or if not, it's coming very shortly, and I hope I didn't let the cat out of the bag. And we've seen another bunch of other announcements we've been briefed on. And we're going to see, we see announcements with Intel Skylake, the latest generation of processors, AMD with EPYC and ARM all jumping in. And there's also continuing efforts to improve power distribution options, and again, we'll hear a minute more about what was being looked at. And the interesting thing about the 200, 400 gig switching is we're also looking at models that do deep buffering, so we're looking at models that are targeting more than a top of rack, which is also important. Another question we asked was, what type of customers, okay, so from which type of verticals are you seeing the greatest interest? So again, this is the vendors telling us what pull they're seeing. And so when you see telco here, 84% of respondents, well, what that means is 84% of the vendors are getting interest from telcos. That's how you have to interpret this. So what we learned was that hyperscalers led the way for tier 2 CSPs and telco in 2016 and maybe 2017. And the telcos really see OCP helping with 5G. That's their, we all know, that's their next big generation rollout, where in fact the telcos become very virtualized, and in fact we know that because we conduct our own research in that, and OCP will likely play a very large role. I saw some pictures, which I can't really talk about too much, about the entire OCP racks that are now going into production in central offices. Bottom half IT, top half PON. We also heard from vendors how governments have been approaching them, keenly interested in OCP because the software ecosystems are open, and they believe that with the software ecosystem being open, there are more eyeballs on the code, and there's less chance that someone's going to slip something in that's malicious. So they feel they can be more secure. I'm not saying that, that's what they told us. I'm not saying I don't believe it either, I'm just the messenger. Also, what we heard from the vendors was the current organizations that are deploying are still fairly large, but the interest is coming from organizations of all sizes. So and that's the normal filter down that we see. So, maybe some people felt that OCP should be going faster. I will tell you that based upon our experience, and we've watched many markets roll out over time, and even a few years ago, I was there saying, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And guess what? It is happening, and it's still happening, I believe, at the pace it probably would happen based upon our experience in how markets roll out. Some of the top drivers are cost reduction and power consumption. So again, 79% of the vendors we talked to said their clients come to them looking for cost reduction. After that, 42% tell us that their customers are looking for power efficiency. One of the things they also are looking for are to get a quick deployment by using integrated racks. So they want an integrated rack where all the power and everything's taken care of, and they can just plug that rack in. That was a significant driver for them. And they talked again and again about cost reduction and power efficiency as the biggest drivers for OCP servers specifically. And perhaps Vlad will get a chance to talk to us a bit more about that. The other thing, surprisingly to me, was that they talked about seeing the OCP, that vendors told us, these customers saw the OCP as a pseudo standardization body. And to me it was a total surprise, because to me OCP is the antithesis of the standards body. It's community discussion and we go, right? However, the people buying the equipment had some faith that there was this uber discussion going on that was bringing some form of commonality that made it less risky for them to deploy. Well, something for the OCP to consider as the market matures and as they mature. Top barriers that we asked the vendors again, what barriers do you have to help your clients overcome to make the sale? And 80% again said integrating with existing equipment and environment were paramount importance. There just aren't that many greenfields out there, and so it has to work as one. We also saw organizational challenge a big issue. Some of the telcos I talked to, even if the CTO shop was gung-ho on OCP, it took quite an effort to get the operational folk in line to see the value and get behind it. And so clearly we heard education is a challenge. Customers still apparently don't know where to buy OCP equipment. It isn't easy for them to trial it. It's pretty hard to plan your purchases 6 months in advance, order a pallet of equipment from Taiwan, and know what you need and hope you've bought the right stuff and hope it works when you plug it in. That's probably too much for many, many of the people still trying to consume OCP equipment, and we did hear this quite a bit. The other is the manageability of the hardware using third-party software. Were certain incumbents, were certain inhibitors, and there was also worry about if I get one OCP server from this vendor and another one from another vendor, are they going to work together? Do I have a problem? Let me see, what else have I got? I have another question here we asked. How do you bring OCP products to market? And I can tell you that this was pretty traditional in the way a market rolls out. The suppliers today told us that based on the scale of the customers they're dealing with, much of it's direct, And because of the custom nature, much of it's direct, and even the customers are looking to the vendors for guidance about how to best deploy the OCP products. So that's also very important. And I will tell you that this profile, again, is very typical in a new market. So there's nothing wrong here. This is exactly as we expect it should be. Going forward, I believe we're going to see the SI partners and the resellers and VARs get bigger as we see this penetrate out. Let me see. Partnerships, again, it was very important for the vendors to be partnering amongst each other. They tend to rely on other OCP vendors. And also, they had different partnerships within region. Again, it makes sense. Depending upon the theater you're trying to operate in, you need the partnerships and channel in that region you're going into. But what I have here now is not summary statements. I went through the data that we collected and only edited the snippets for a little bit of context so they would be understandable. But what you have here are bullets from specific vendor responses. So if you look at this, what I'm saying here when I say hyperscaler deployments are the current majority, that was one vendor telling me that. Well, it's not a summary statement. So I tried to pull out some of the statements that were made during the interviews that were insightful to share with you. Another statement that was made was telco of all sizes and financials are still exploring, deployments still to come. One vendor told us that for them, they had 7 key verticals. Honestly, I think that's a lot of key verticals, but they were telco, web scale cloud, high tech, education, manufacturing, financial services, and transportation. Another vendor said to us that they thought the biggest value is standards capabilities from open networking features. That helped a lot. And that they also said that customers need a software division and a secret recipe to really make the most of OCP. So one vendor found that, you know what, it really wasn't that easy, is what they were saying for their clients. We had other vendors that said that customers don't want to pay for features they are not going to use. A lot of the reasons that the hyperscalers originally went into and built OCP is that they wanted to be able to pair out the features they didn't need. And integration is a challenge. It was another statement we got from the vendors. Education is a challenge and a big barrier. So the need to educate the customers on suppliers, how to try, will it integrate, were some of the elements that one vendor said paramount importance that they faced in pushing in selling OCP equipment. Let me see, these slides will be available, I believe, to everyone. You essentially, and then one vendor said, you essentially get what is provided, and it's up to you, the customer, to figure the rest out. And I think they were saying, that's not so good. It's kind of a big barrier. Only a few customers can figure that out. Now, we also interviewed end users, and I thought I would share with you some of the comments from the end users. And what I thought was really interesting is the end users told us, for them, the next frontier is going to be disaggregation at optical transport. That's what they want next. And they're going to work towards that. And so what we heard from the users, current telco deployments are on a small scale, usually less than a dozen racks, sometimes as little as half a rack. So really still tiny in some cases. All the interviewees that we talked about have plans for expanded deployments. So all the end users said, and very interesting, one said their mantra is, look at using OCP first, and only if it's not suitable to the purpose do they choose different equipment. So there's one very strong supporter in the end user side. That's a very large telco. The major OCP use cases cited by telco companies include video on demand, voice, data, and VPN for enterprise. The other comment we had was when they're ready to purchase at scale, they were going to go to their existing vendors and say, thou shalt supply OCP equipment to me. So to me, that means when I think of Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei, when they get those thou shalts from their suppliers, from their customers, what are they going to do? It's going to be interesting to see that. By the way, that's not the first time that's happened. That's happened many times in the past as we went through transformations. The other elements that we heard that I think were interesting for the room to know about were users wanted a common way to manage the infrastructure, and the disaggregation of the hardware and software were important drivers that they cited. So this is now the end users citing their drivers, not the vendors telling us. Some of the hesitation in adoption from the end users is because of the delay in software development. Again, developing the software was a barrier that the users saw. And with the tier 2 service providers, we saw them citing distribution as an issue. They found it very difficult, in their own words, to purchase from a Taiwanese vendor for a Brazilian deployment, for example, was a very big challenge. To get those pallets over to Latin America was hard. So they would really love to have a more local way to do that and not have to worry about supply chain issues. The other thing was, they said that they are looking for more variations on UCPE. And for those of us that are not aware, Universal CPE is a very important new form factor that is being rolled out by telcos as part of the NFV rollout. And I can tell you, aside from the OCP work, we track that market, and IHS Markit, and my team actually, forecasts that the UCPE market will be worth near $450 million in revenue to vendors by 2021. And I'll bet a good portion of that is going to be OCP equipment. And we also heard the users tell us they want more variations. They want to see ARM, not only x86 in UCPE. They want to see co-processors like GPUs potentially available. And they want improved software ecosystems. So we're seeing all of that demand. And they're looking for the maturity on how do they deploy compute at the edge, and looking at UCPE to be part of that rollout. Okay, well that was the end of the prepared presentation that I had. I do have a couple questions that I would like to put to Maggie and Vlad, specifically on servers and rack and power, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So hopefully you'll have some stimulating questions for them as well. And so let me start with Vlad, since you're the farthest over on the left, my left. And the question I had for you is, when we think of servers, right, are there some specific requirements that telco customers had that you heard about that you wanted to share with the audience?
Yes, thank you. And actually, telcos and OCP as a market was something that we started researching even before this project. This project was just a nice excuse to talk to more vendors and to talk to more telcos, which I think we all really appreciated. But I think the telco market has some very specific regulations that vendors selling into the market need to think about when addressing telcos. It's not just about selling your standard server. And some of those are, for example, telcos are subject to seismic tolerance regulations. Servers that are sold to telcos in the racks need to be able to have a higher standard for seismic tolerance. Another one is electric magnetic shielding, and I actually saw a very interesting solution from one OCP vendor who basically has devised a very ingenious solution to provide that. And my understanding is they will share it with the OCP, so I won't reveal who they are in more detail, but they'll do it. Another one is longer life support, and especially as someone who's worked for many years in your non-traditional market in EMEA, which I'd include the telcos, they really require longer life support. So the servers that they buy, they will really need the vendors to be able to, be contacted and help when a problem arises. And then also, server vendors need to work with the rack vendors to make sure that they can work with DC power, because telcos have not necessarily transitioned, and maybe some will never transition to AC power. But that was just some of the specifics.
Thanks, Vlad. And let's see what Maggie has to tell us about some of the major barriers for new vendors to supply rack and power products
Sure.
for OCP specs.
Sure, thanks, Cliff. I think one of the major barriers that many rack and power providers are having in order to supply OCP products is that there's no repeatability in the specifications that they're getting from customers. So with every new customer that comes on board, it tends to be a completely customized solution that is OCP inspired or OCP approved, but maybe a tweaking on the voltage or the amperage or the dimensions. For the racks, and that makes it really hard in order, if you have a run rate business, to sort of gain the same margins and also invest all of those engineering hours into developing those new products, especially if you don't have a large customer or many customers doing that. And that's sort of one of the, I think, the top barriers is just the lack of pure standardization among the rack and power products.
Okay, thank you. So, Vlad, I do have one more question for you. I was wondering if you had a chance to identify in terms of your research any specific reasons that might be delaying OCP servers in the enterprise.
Yeah, and actually, I think we talked a lot about telcos. I think everyone is familiar with hyperscale challenges. I think on enterprise, we heard one very specific answer that I really wanted to make sure that I kind of convey with our panel. So yes, for a lot of customers outside of the enterprise, cost reduction, power efficiency are very important. But in the enterprise, actually, those are not the top decision, the top decision reasons. Enterprises are really looking for flexibility in their hardware, and that's where interoperability comes to play. They really, and especially a lot of the new enterprise opportunities that we've identified, for example, with e-commerce customers, with those web-based fair, travel fair comparison websites, they're looking for the opportunity to use and to buy servers from different vendors and for them to be interoperable, and that is a challenge. And another challenge was that, and this came up several times, was that customers are struggling to decide on which of the kind of two main form factors within the OCP is best fit for them. Do they go with the OCP 19-inch rack that is the Project Olympus style rack server, or do they go with the original open rack server, the Tioga Pass, for example, specification? So they're really looking for some guidance from vendors and like a workload-led conversation as to what to choose.
Okay, I have one more question for Maggie, and then I do have other questions, but I think I'd like to open up the floor to the audience first and see if they have some questions. So Maggie, just one for you, and then we'll open it up for some questions. And I think you had a good one here. Can you tell us what has to change for more vendors to participate in the market?
Sure. So back to the original question of the problems that custom draw, I think is really getting a set of standards. Obviously, OCP currently has the 4 core standards of the CG Open Rack, the Open Rack version 2, and then EIA 310 racks, and then also Project Olympus, as Vlad just mentioned, and getting a little bit more standard specifications for specific customers. So potentially the idea is having a set of standards of particular use cases. So you could imagine for, as you just mentioned, a web developer company of a specific set of designs of a fully integrated rack with a power solution versus a telco deployment that you're seeing those half racks because of floor weight requirements, and even some movement with different power distribution architectures in the rack for cold storage, which obviously utilizes less power. So I think that's sort of the end game, is getting a collection of vendors to really focus on what are the repeatable, actionable items in rack and power to make it easier to develop and shorter those lead times.
Thank you. The mics are right there and there. if people would like, can you please step over to the mic and just get in line? And there are two mics. There's one there and there's one there. So why don't we kind of alternate? If you could go first while you're already at the mic, and then we'll have you go next. Go ahead.
Yeah, the total market you mentioned, $130 billion. Is that including the onboard OCP members, or is
So that's the total market,
including
everything.
Okay, and you mentioned there's a segment, there's a telco, and you mentioned there's a tier 2. How you classify this differently?
Okay. So we had, the segments we had were cloud service provider or hyperscale. So in cloud service provider, we had hyperscaler.
Right.
And that was more than 3 million of square footage in their data centers. Okay. So the tier 2 cloud service providers were under 3 million.
Okay.
Okay. And then we had telco and, right.
Okay, thank you.
Should we alternate, or?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So why do you think that customers see OCP as a pseudo standards body when in fact it's the antithesis of a standards body?
Okay, so you're asking me my opinion?
Absolutely. I think that you spoke to many different participants in
Yeah.
this ecosystem, and you might have some insight as to why this perception exists.
Well, I think it does because you go to the website and you open up a spec, and there's a spec, right? And there's a spec that multiple people worked on. So that's kind of what you see when you look at standards bodies. So you can get that impression. Right.
Okay, thank you.
Alan?
Thank you, Cliff. You had mentioned that telcos see 5G as a main driver for OCP, or they'd like OCP to help them with 5G in areas like virtualization and software-defined network, correct?
Yeah. So it's not it's not OCP as a driver of 5G. It's that they see OCP equipment as being part of the
equipment
solution.
Well, to helping them.
Yeah.
Now that corroborates my findings. However, the single group that's responsible for true 5G standards, IMT 2020, ITUR Working Party 5D, does not have virtualization, software-defined network, NFV in their work scope. So is OCP or Telecom Infrastructure Project going to be a de facto standards body to help in those areas that ITUR is not touching?
Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to speak for either the OCP nor the telco standards
Well,
bodies.
that's a follow-on
Now-
to this gentleman's question about
Now-
OCP being a standards body.
So we asked if we speculate, could it end up that the users just go with what's available?
Let me state
and it
emphatically.
becomes a de facto
There
standard?
is no official standards body.
I
that
hear you.
But
But
is looking at
like-
software-defined networks, virtualization, NFV, or anything like open networking for IMT 2020.
Right, but there's such things as de facto standards. I mean, for open source, we have de facto standards because people commonly use them. And so we could see some of the equipment here becoming a de facto standard. That would be my thinking.
And do you think that might be, personal opinion, do you think that might be from OCP or from the Telecom Infrastructure Project?
Oh, I don't know. I couldn't speculate on that, sorry.
Cliff, great data. So you mentioned some of the codes from the customers. Can you give some idea about the sample of the customer data you sample it in terms of how many in telco versus other verticals you sample it?
Yeah, so what I'll say is, rather than give you a number, I'll tell you that we talked to the vendors that represent the vast majority of the spend on OCP equipment.
So the data is mostly from the vendor, not from the customers?
So there were two sets of data.
Yeah.
And so for the end users, we talked with the telcos that represent I would say the vast majority of the leading houses, organizations in the market.
So the data is mostly from the telco, not from other verticals like financials or manufacturing or is that
Yeah,
correct?
the end users were all, as I said in the first slide. So we talked to telcos, we talked to cloud service providers and co-location providers.
Got it. Thank you.
it was pretty hard to get an enterprise that was willing to talk to us, unfortunately. Maybe next time.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Could you expand on the sourcing issue? Is the marketplace not working as intended?
I'm not
Actually,
sure if you guys can.
Yeah,
help me with
I can definitely step in. Well, one of the challenges that I heard over and over as I interviewed both sides of the spectrum is that a lot of the really big vendors of OCP servers, and I think that's probably the same for all OCP equipment, are looking to have a direct relationship with like one really big customer. And they really, so far, have very much worked only with the biggest hyperscale CSPs. So the rest of the market, maybe excluding kind of the biggest telcos, the rest of the market, such as enterprises, smaller tier 2 CSPs, have had to use, wherever it is available, a distribution network. But that distribution network, I am understanding from my conversations, is not developed enough. There needs to be work by the OCP equipment vendors to really build a network of people willing to distribute equipment and really help customers with POCs, with engineering, and kind of go the next level. And especially in some regions, it was identified that there is very little work with distributors. If you compare a traditional server vendor, so a HP or a Dell, right, who is shipping branded racks and blade servers, they have a huge distributor network. So they're able to really address smaller enterprises or just in general the wider market because they don't have to work directly with everyone. And that seems to be a challenge for me. And I personally don't think the OCP marketplace, while I can see it improving, is there yet to be the one-stop shop for people to get information or to purchase.
Have you seen much energy behind developing that supply chain?
Quite frankly, some vendors were more eager to do that than others. Some OCP equipment vendors simply said that they are not looking to at all address the broader market.
Yeah, perhaps we could also get their perspective from the rack side. I think that was important.
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest issues is the idea of needing, again, the custom specifications, but also for the rack side of thing, when you're doing custom orders, you just don't want to do the proof of concept level, the ones, the twos, when those come through. And so that makes it sort of difficult for enterprises to source it. I know the OCP Foundation is sort of working to fix this problem with some of the new criteria in order to be a member on the marketplace of having to sell to any size enterprise. And so hopefully that's going to solve some of it as it pushes more and more of those big providers into that sort of scheme to provide it to even the smallest of orders.
Thank you.
Thanks.
By the way, one of the interesting things that's happened, I think, is that more vendors are, as you said, like we think more vendors are entering all of the OCP equipment space. As more vendors offer OCP equipment, that's definitely going to be help, in my opinion, to reach a broader customer base.
I think we have another question.
Yeah, I have two questions. So first question is for the telcos who adopt the OCP product. Is any telco taking the OCP solutions as a mainstream for now, basically deployed in a fairly scale as a main solution? That's the first question. The second question for the OCP community, OCP vendors. So from you research, how's the overall ecosystem, meaning the financial-wise, what's the general status? The overall OCP community, they're quite profit or just they're...
Okay, so the first question I probably have a better chance to answer. I did not look at the financials of the vendors that we interviewed. We didn't do a financial audit, so it's would probably be inappropriate for me to speculate on that. I do know incidental data on the couple of the vendors that I talked to. Their revenue grew significantly in the last year, but whether that's profitable or not, I could not answer. Your first question on the telcos, so I will say no, there aren't any large-scale production deployments yet. but then that's bundled in with SDN and NFV, and there aren't really any large-scale production deployments of NFV yet. So it's going with that.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, oh, someone's coming with a question. All right, we have a couple more minutes to entertain it.
Sorry, when you talked to the telco folks, did they have any discussion about how they're going to handle NEBS compliance with OCP equipment?
Didn't seem to come up. So I'm not sure what that meant, but didn't seem to come up.
Okay.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time. I hope you enjoyed the research and learned something from today. This is the team at IHS Markit that that did the work. So I just wanted everyone to meet the team. And with that, we'll see you again maybe next year here. Thank you.
Thank you.